Greetings everyone. Welcome to the lecture on developments in education. In this lecture, I shall be discussing with you the several changes that came about in contemporary India, especially after independence, in the field of education. So, if we consider the journey of India's educational system in the past several decades, then at the time of independence, the country had only 20 universities. Now there are about more than 1,000 universities and university level institutions. There were only 4 to 500 colleges then, but now the number is in thousands. The student enrollment and universities now stands at several millions. The country now produces several million graduates and thousands of PhDs annually and has become an important research hub. India has the second largest pool of trained scientists, engineers integrated into the global intellectual system to a degree that is without parallel outside the developed world. The growth of vocational education and several institutions imparting management, engineering and IT education as well as education for new professions is the reality today. The steady growth in the private sector's role in the field of education also cannot be neglected, and also a continuing effort on enhancing the level of quality and excellence in several academic institutions is also a reality. Several efforts were made by the government after independence to reach the present development, and constitutional provisions and policies played a very important role in this. The socio-economic background of the country played a very important role in deciding the kind of policies that had to be adopted. So, the national policies on education depended on several factors like the socio-economic background of the country, then the Constitution of India, which was based on the pillars of equality, liberty, fraternity, justice, as well as the status of education that existed during independence. Before we continue with the changes that came about after independence, I would barely mention the characteristics of colonial education system, because I have already dealt in detail with the colonial system of education as it prevailed in India in some of the earlier lectures. So, if we talk about the characteristics of colonial education system, then we can say that the institutions were such that both the quantity and the quality were lacking. There was very low literacy rate, levels of enrollment in higher education was very minimal, and education largely catered to the needs of colonial administration. The emphasis was on creating a class of Indians who could serve as clerks and could assist the colonial administrators, and nothing more than that. Agricultural production was very less due to non-availability of technical knowledge. No technology-based manpower was being used for the economic development of the country. Also, there were multi-level educational systems like primary, secondary, higher education, higher tertiary, post-graduation. But higher education institutions were concentrated mostly in port cities. Also, education was evaluated on the basis of teaching, but not on the basis of learning. Also, there was a very weak base for national integration, because as colonial rulers, Britishers were definitely not in favor of any kind of national integration. The socio-economic base of education was also extremely low. So therefore, there were a number of challenges in independent India in the field of education. Transformation from colonial serving type of education to self-reliant education had to be made in a very short span of time after 1947. Also, there was a need to establish linkage between education and labour market, which also was clearly missing. There was also a need to reduce regional disparities because higher education was limited to the port cities. Then socio-economic education base through protective discrimination also had to be established. Also, there was a need to have meaningful education which could boost the cause of national integration. So therefore, let us consider several education policies that were implemented in free India with these very aims in mind. If we talk about the genesis of national policies, then after independence, several committees and commissions were held from time to time in order to redirect the colonial education system of the country and to make it more suitable and conducive to the needs and requirements of independent India. So there was clearly a need to reorient the already existing educational system. So in 1950, there was a division of responsibilities between Government of India and the states, and the 42nd Amendment of Part 4th Directive Principles of State Policies included education under concurrent list. The most important development came in the form of free and compulsory primary education, which is mentioned in Article 45 of Indian Constitution. Then education of minorities, Article 29 Part 3 under fundamental rights mentioned about the protection of interests of minorities, and Article 30 gave right of minorities to establish and administer educational institutions. This was a very important development. Now both these articles, that is Article 29 and Article 30, they ensure minorities' self-interests as safe in independent India. Also, importance was given to mother tongue under Special Article 350 A and B, Part 17, under Special Directives, facilities for instruction in mother tongue at primary stage was implemented. Then there was to be a special officer for linguistic minorities. President appoints to investigate all matters relating to the safeguards provided for linguistic minorities. Importance was also given to education for weaker sections. Article 15th and 17th Part 3rd under Fundamental Rights mentions prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex or place of birth. And Article 15 also declares that the state can make special provisions for the education of women and children, because they also came under weaker sections, marginalized sections, who had been not been treated at par as compared to men. Then another very important development had been abolition of untouchability, as stated in Article 17, and Article 46 Part 3 mentioned freedom of conscience and free profession practice as well as propagation of religion. Special emphasis was made for women's education as it came through Article 15 Part 2, which mentioned prohibition of any kind of discrimination on the grounds of sex, and Article 16 mentioned equality of opportunities on matters of public employment, thereby safeguarding rights of education as well as employment for women. Development of Hindi also was taken care of as Article 351 under these special directives mentioned development of Hindi language, and it was declared as a duty of Union government to promote Hindi. Then one can also talk about several other aims that were set out and which were very essential to formulate national policies on education in India. One such aim was to accelerate the pace of national development and to provide emotional integration as well as to implement it various programs through commissions and committees. And some of the important commissions were the University Education Commission of 1948-49, followed by the Secondary Education Commission 1952-53, then Indian Education Commission 1964-66, finally the New Education Policy 1986. Now, if we talk about the University Education Commission, which was also known as Radha Krishnan Commission, then the University Education Commission made recommendations for improving the quality of higher education. It also advocated use of mother tongue as medium of instruction, and also it lay emphasis on the fact that higher education should be built on the values of Indian heritage and culture. It also suggested for 11 years of schooling and 3 years of college. Admission of students and appointment of teachers on the basis of merit also was discussed as an important policy. The next important commission of 1952 to 53, which was also known as Mudaliar Committee, which was based on the recommendations of Mudaliar Committee, it lay emphasis on restructuring of secondary education in India. It also highlighted importance of moral education to build the character. Also, it highlighted the importance of guidance services in schools, reformation in the examination system, and also emphasized once again on using mother tongue throughout the school. By the end of the third plan, the need was felt to get the entire educational system reviewed with the view of initiating a fresh and more determined efforts for education reconstruction. A review committee therefore was set up, and a worked out policy was based on certain goals. This happened somewhere between 1964 to 66. So, it took almost 2 years to set out nationally accepted goals. So, what were these goals on the basis of which now education policy was to be formulated? These were the goals of enhancing productivity so that the country could progress. Then also the goal of modernization, democratization, social and national integration, as well as instilling social, moral and spiritual values. As a result, from 1964 to 66, the commission, which is also known as D.S. Kothari Commission, became very important. It contributed immensely to the growth of national system of education. It was designed as a tool for socialism as well as secularism. It kind of visualized a revolution in education with its socio-economic, cultural dimensions, and accordingly, the National Policy of Education in 1968 was resolved by the Government of India for promotion of the development, and the recommendations of Kothari Commission became part of NPE 1968. The salient features of NPE 1968 were free and compulsory education. The view of realizing the directive principles of Article 45, special efforts had to be made for providing free and compulsory education, because even after 20 years of independence, this goal had not been achieved. So, therefore, essential steps had to be taken for reducing wastage as well as stagnation in schools. By wastage and stagnation in schools, it means that while the students are taking admission, but they are dropping out without completing their education. So, this trend had to be stopped. Also, there was a need to ensure successful completion of the prescribed courses once they had been started. Also, the status and service conditions of teachers had to be taken care of. This was needed in order to enhance the quality of education, so that the teachers not only get an honorable place in society, but they also get paid adequately, and also their service conditions are taken care of. So, academic freedom was also one factor that came to be talked about, and in-service training from time to time was discussed as the need of the hour in order to ensure quality in education. Then the third important goal was development of language, especially Indian languages, which were essential for the cultural development of the country also. Regional languages had already been implemented in primary and secondary stage, and now they were also being considered for university level education. Another important goal was equal opportunities in educational institutions, so as to remove regional imbalances and also to promote social cohesion and thereby promote national integrity. Some other important factors associated with equal opportunities were the issue of girls' education, issue of education for backward classes, tribal education, education for physically handicapped students, and so on and so forth. Also, there was a need that was felt for identification of talent at an early stage, which could be nurtured, and thereby honing the skills of the students right from the childhood. So, for this, work experience and national service came to be considered as very important for not only self-help, but also character formation, as well as to instill some kind of social commitments in the minds of students. Then science education and research were considered as the high priority areas. So, both science and maths were to be integral part of general education till the end of school education, so that students with a scientific bent of mind could be prepared, who could deal with the challenges of the future world. Then also it was considered as a high priority to give importance to education for agriculture and industry related goals. So, what was proposed was one agricultural university to be established in each state, which was to impart practical training. And practical training of industry also was considered as very important part of technical education. So therefore, what was proposed was a review of agriculture and industry in order to generate more and more technical manpower. Production of books also was considered as a very important factor. Best writing talent had to be tapped so as to produce quality books, and this could be done through a liberal policy of remuneration and providing adequate incentives from time to time. Also, what was proposed was changes of textbooks to be avoided based on political reasons. Also, autonomous book banks had to be developed so as to establish some kind of a commercial line in order to ensure that there was no shortage of supply of books. Adequate attention was also paid to the issue of examination. Necessary reforms had to be introduced in the examination in order to establish reliability as well as validity of examination, and evaluation was to become a continuous process in order to improve the performance of students. So, reducing the emphasis on holding only annual exam and encouraging continuous evaluation as a process was a very important change that was proposed. In the field of secondary education, an attempt was made to extend educational opportunity as a major instrument of change. So, for this, secondary education had to be encouraged, and also a university of education to be established where teachers were to be trained. There were going to be graduate and postgraduate courses in teacher training as well as in research. Another very important aspect was correspondence courses and also part-time education, especially for those who had joined the workforce, but they still wanted to continue their education. So, this issue was brought up on a large scale at the university stage, that such facilities should be developed from secondary stage onwards. Adult education also was considered as very important part of democratization of education and to promote the program of mass literacy, especially from 1970s onwards. Lot of emphasis also came to be put on games, sports, fitness, etc. Now, a very important part that an educational structure could play in this overall process of change came with the objective of having a uniform structure throughout the country, which means 10 plus 2 plus 3 pattern, and investment in the level of expenditure also went up to 6% of the national income. However, there were several bottlenecks which came in the way of implementation of NPE 1968. However, by 1985, the country had reached the stage in its economic and technical development to derive maximum benefits, and therefore government announced for new education policy in 1986. Now, if we consider the NPE 1986, it was reviewed and suggested, and lot of emphasis was put on creativity, on generating new ideas, that how on the basis of new ideas a national system of education with considerable flexibility and a broad national framework could be evolved. This again had the goal of providing equal opportunities to all, both in terms of access to education as well as quality of education. The overall idea was removal of disparities and to equalize educational opportunities in diverse regional areas. A large and systematic program of non-formal education was to be launched for the school dropouts so that they could be brought into the ambit of education once again. And this policy also highlighted the importance of 3-language formula. It recommended a common education structure which was primary for 5 years, upper primary for 3 years and high school for 2 years. The national curriculum structure was to include some common components of history, Indian freedom struggle, etc. And there was emphasis on secondary education, vocational education, as well as democratization of principles, values, ethos, and how all these could be internalized within education itself. Minimum level of learning of each stage of education also was highlighted, and there was lot of emphasis on understanding cultural diversities as they were prevailing in India. It also facilitated inter-regional mobility as well as pooling of resources in order to make full use of available resources. There was also emphasis on open and distance learning with the initiative of Doordarshan as well as IGNOU. And there was strengthening of national institutes like UGC, AICTE, NCERT, ICAR, IMC, and all this was being done in order to ensure accountability and quality in education. Thank you.